The phone rang at 12:07 a.m., cutting through the silence of our suburban Seattle home like a blade through silk. I knew before answering that nothing good ever came from calls at this hour. 20 years in military IT, then 5 more managing security systems for Northwest Medical Center had taught me that midnight conversations usually meant someone's world was about to collapse. "Grant Solen," I answered, keeping my voice level despite the knot forming in my stomach. "Your wife left her underwear in my office." The voice belonged to Victor Dornell, chief of surgery and my wife Tessa's department head. He sounded intoxicated, triumphant. Should I mail them or will she pick them up Monday? The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Victor expected rage, shouting, maybe threats. Instead, I let the quiet do the work. In my experience, silence unnerved guilty people more than fury ever could. "Keep them," I finally said, my voice steady as granite. "She'll need something to remember you by after I send your wife the security footage." The change in Victor's breathing was immediate. The confident swagger evaporated, replaced by something that sounded like panic. "Security footage?" His voice cracked slightly. "What security footage?" "The kind that shows exactly what's been happening in your office for the past 7 weeks, Victor. High definition, time-stamped, archived on 3 separate servers." I paused, letting that sink in. "Your wife Isla works hospital legal, doesn't she? I imagine she'd find the documentation quite thorough." The begging started at the 14-second mark. "Grant, listen, we can work this out. There's no need to involve anyone else. What do you want? Money? I can transfer—" "Victor," I interrupted, "you called me at midnight to gloat about sleeping with my wife. Did you really think I'd just roll over?" I ended the call and immediately activated the recording app I'd started the moment I heard his voice. Every desperate word, every incriminating statement now preserved in digital amber. In my line of work, you learned to document everything. Evidence was power, and power was the only currency that mattered when your world started crumbling. Tessa lay beside me, supposedly asleep, though her breathing pattern suggested otherwise. She'd been working late frequently over the past 2 months, coming home with stories about budget meetings and staffing reviews that never quite added up. The pieces had been clicking into place for weeks, but hearing Victor's voice confirm my suspicions still felt like a punch to the chest. I slipped out of bed and padded to my home office, where 3 monitors displayed the security management interface for Northwest Medical Center. As head of campus security, I had access to every camera, every keycard log, every digital footprint in the facility. The system was my domain, and I'd built it to be comprehensive. The archived footage from Victor's office corridor painted a clear picture. Tessa entering at odd hours, staying late, leaving with disheveled hair and wrinkled scrubs. Victor's office door closing for extended periods during times when no surgeries were scheduled. The pattern was methodical, almost routine, but as I dug deeper into the system, I discovered something far more interesting than a simple affair. Victor's workstation access logs showed unusual activity. Patient files opened after hours, billing codes modified, insurance claims adjusted. The man wasn't just cheating on his wife, he was manipulating medical records. My military training had taught me to gather intelligence before engaging the enemy. Victor Dornell might be chief of surgery, but he'd made a critical error. He'd declared war on someone who controlled the very systems that could destroy him. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Seattle weather that matched my mood perfectly. Tessa moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, chatting about her day as if nothing had changed. Her performance was flawless, almost admirable in its audacity. "I might be late again tonight," she said, pouring coffee into her travel mug. "Victor scheduled another department meeting about the new protocols." "I'm sure he did," I replied, not looking up from my laptop. "Those protocols must be quite complex, requiring so many after-hours discussions." She paused, perhaps catching something in my tone, but recovered quickly. "You know how he is about details." "Indeed I do," After she left, I called my IT specialist, Rico Martinez, one of the few people at the hospital I trusted completely. Rico had worked with me for 3 years, helping design and maintain our security infrastructure. He was sharp, discreet, and had a talent for extracting data from reluctant systems. Rico, I need you to run a deep audit on Victor Dornell's office workstation. Everything: file access, email logs, network activity for the past 6 months. Something specific I should look for? Irregularities, pattern breaks, anything that doesn't match standard protocol. Rico's findings arrived 2 hours later via encrypted message. Victor's digital footprint revealed a complex web of malpractice cover-ups, altered patient records, and fraudulent billing practices. But the most damaging discovery was a series of shell companies linked to medical equipment purchases, companies that existed only on paper, funneling hospital funds into private accounts. One of those shell companies bore Tessa's forged signature as a co-signer. The affair suddenly made perfect sense. Victor hadn't just been using my wife. He'd been using her identity to legitimize his fraud scheme. The man had been financing his corruption with stolen credentials while sleeping with the victim's wife. The audacity was almost impressive. I spent the afternoon building a comprehensive evidence file. Screenshots, financial records, security footage, recorded phone calls, everything organized into a package that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. But I needed to be strategic about deployment. Victor Dornell had powerful friends on the hospital board, political connections throughout the city. A direct assault would likely fail. Instead, I decided to start with his greatest vulnerability: his wife. Isla Corvin Dornell served as legal counsel for Northwest Medical Center, a position that made her both powerful and exposed. If Victor's fraud came to light, her own career would face scrutiny. She'd have every incentive to distance herself from her husband's crimes, perhaps even assist in his downfall. The email I sent her was brief and professional. Mrs. Dornell, I've discovered some billing irregularities that may require legal review. Could we schedule a confidential meeting to discuss the hospital's potential exposure? This matter is time-sensitive and involves your husband's department. Her response came within 20 minutes. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. my office, come alone. The trap was set. Victor Dornell thought he'd won by claiming my wife, but he'd actually handed me the weapons to destroy him. Sometimes the best revenge was simply letting guilty people reveal their own crimes. As I prepared for bed that night, Tessa returned home with another story about budget reviews and staffing concerns. She kissed my cheek with lips that had been on another man, smiled with eyes that held secrets she thought I'd never discover. "How was your day?" she asked, the picture of innocent concern. "Productive," I replied. "Very productive indeed." Isla Corvin Dornell's office occupied a corner of the hospital's administrative wing, with windows overlooking the Seattle skyline and walls lined with legal texts that probably hadn't been opened in years. She was a handsome woman in her mid-40s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that made her dangerous in negotiations. "Mr. Solen," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her mahogany desk. "Your message mentioned billing irregularities in my husband's department." I placed a tablet on her desk, already loaded with the evidence Rico and I had compiled. These are financial records showing unauthorized equipment purchases, altered patient billing, and insurance fraud dating back 18 months. The trail leads directly to your husband's administrative access. Her face remained impassive as she scrolled through the documents, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her fingers gripped the tablet just a little too firmly. She was calculating, not just Victor's exposure, but her own. "These are serious allegations," she said finally. "Do you have additional documentation?" I handed her a USB drive. "Everything's there. Bank records, email communications, system access logs. Your husband has been running a sophisticated fraud operation through shell companies, using forged signatures to legitimize the transactions. Forged signatures? Including my wife's. Apparently, Victor's been quite creative in his approach to document authentication. That got her attention. Isla's professional composure cracked slightly, revealing something harder underneath. Your wife signed these documents? Her signature appears on them. Whether she actually signed them is another question entirely. I leaned back in my chair, watching her process the implications. Of course, there might be other factors affecting her judgment lately. Personal entanglements that could compromise her decision-making. The silence stretched between us like a blade. Isla was no fool. She could read between the lines as well as anyone in her position. The question was whether she'd choose to protect her husband or protect herself. What do you want, Mr. Solen? Justice. Victor has been stealing from this hospital, manipulating patient records and involving innocent people in his schemes. The evidence speaks for itself. And the personal entanglements you mentioned? I pulled out my phone and showed her a still frame from the security footage. Victor and Tessa in his office, their activities leaving little room for interpretation. This is from last Tuesday evening around 8 p.m. The timestamp is clearly visible. Isla stared at the image for a long moment, her face revealing nothing. When she finally looked up, her eyes held a coldness that would have frozen helium. I'll need time to review all this evidence thoroughly. Of course. But I should mention that I've prepared copies for the hospital board, the state medical licensing authority, and the FBI's healthcare fraud division. I'm hoping we can resolve this internally, but that depends on how seriously the hospital takes these violations. She understood the threat perfectly. Isla had built her career on managing the hospital's legal exposure, protecting the institution from exactly this kind of scandal. Victor's fraud put everything at risk, including her own reputation. Give me 48 hours, she said. Agreed. But Mrs. Dornell? If Victor attempts to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses, all bets are off. The full package goes public immediately. I left her office feeling like a chess player who'd just achieved checkmate in 7 moves. Victor might have thought he was winning by seducing my wife, but he'd actually positioned himself for total destruction. The hospital's annual fundraising gala was scheduled for Saturday night, 3 days away. It would be the perfect venue for Victor's public humiliation, a room full of donors, board members, and medical staff who'd witness his fall from grace. I began planning accordingly. That evening, Tessa came home with another excuse about late meetings and departmental reviews. She'd grown careless in her lies, perhaps assuming I was too trusting or too stupid to notice the inconsistencies. The irony was delicious. She thought she was deceiving me while I was orchestrating her lover's destruction. Victor seems stressed lately, she mentioned casually while preparing dinner. He's been distracted during meetings, making unusual decisions. Stress can affect judgment, I agreed. Sometimes people make choices that seem logical in the moment, but prove catastrophic in hindsight. She nodded, completely missing the warning in my words. He's under a lot of pressure from the board about departmental performance. I imagine that pressure is about to increase significantly. The next morning brought a call from Rico with additional intelligence. Grant, you need to see this. I found encrypted files on Victor's backup drive, patient records that were altered after malpractice incidents. He's been covering up surgical errors, changing documentation to avoid liability. How many cases? At least 12 over the past 2 years. Patients who suffered complications that were never properly reported. Families who never knew their loved ones were victims of negligence. The scope of Victor's crimes was expanding beyond simple fraud into genuine harm to patients and families. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about justice for people who'd been victimized by a corrupt system. I spent the day documenting everything, building an ironclad case that would survive any legal challenge. Victor Dornell had made the mistake of targeting someone with both the skills and the access to expose his entire operation. His affair with Tessa was about to become the least of his problems. Friday afternoon brought a text message from Isla. "Meet me at the Fairmont Olympic bar area, 6 p.m. Come alone." The hotel bar was dimly lit and mostly empty, perfect for confidential conversations. Isla sat in a corner booth, already nursing what looked like her second martini. She'd traded her professional attire for jeans and a sweater, looking more like someone's aunt than a high-powered attorney. "I've reviewed your evidence," she said without preamble. "It's comprehensive and damning. Victor has been stealing from the hospital for over a year." "And the malpractice cover-ups?" "Those are the most serious charges. Patients died because of his negligence, and he falsified records to hide his mistakes." She took a long sip of her martini. "I've already contacted the state medical board and the FBI. Victor will be arrested Monday morning." "What about the hospital's exposure?" "We'll cooperate fully with the investigation, terminate Victor immediately, and establish a victim compensation fund. The board voted unanimously this afternoon. Victor Dornell is finished." I felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal revenge. Justice was finally coming for the patients and families Victor had wronged. "There's one more thing," Isla continued. "Your wife's involvement in the financial fraud. Her signature appears on multiple documents authorizing equipment purchases." "Forged signatures, as we discussed?" "Perhaps. But she'll need to prove that in court. The FBI will want to interview her extensively." The net was closing around both Victor and Tessa. Their affair had led them into a criminal conspiracy that would destroy their careers and possibly land them in federal prison. "The gala tomorrow night should be interesting," I observed. Isla smiled coldly. "Victor doesn't know what's coming. He still thinks he's untouchable, that his position and connections will protect him. He's about to learn otherwise. And Tessa? She made her choices, Mr. Solen. Now she'll face the consequences." As I drove home through the Seattle evening traffic, I reflected on how completely the situation had reversed. A week ago, Victor had called to gloat about his conquest of my wife. Now he was facing criminal charges, professional ruin, and public humiliation. Sometimes the best revenge was simply letting corrupt people destroy themselves with their own greed and arrogance. The gala would be Victor's final performance, his last moments in the spotlight before everything came crashing down. I planned to enjoy every second of his fall. The Four Seasons ballroom glittered with the kind of orchestrated elegance that only serious money could buy. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in ivory silk, while Seattle's medical elite mingled in their finest formal wear. The hospital's annual fundraising gala represented the pinnacle of professional networking, where careers were made and reputations cemented or destroyed. I adjusted my bow tie and surveyed the room, noting the strategic positioning of key players. Victor held court near the bar, regaling donors with stories of his surgical prowess, completely unaware that his world would collapse in approximately 18 hours. Tessa moved through the crowd in a black evening gown that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, playing her role as the devoted department administrator. The irony was exquisite. They thought they were celebrating their success while actually attending their own funeral. "Grant," Dr. Michael Schultz approached with a champagne flute in hand. Schultz served as chief of cardiology and had been Victor's primary rival for years, competing for resources, recognition, and influence within the hospital hierarchy. "Wonderful turnout tonight. The development office outdid themselves." "Indeed they did. Should be a memorable evening for everyone involved." Something in my tone caught his attention. Schultz was sharp, politically astute, and had survived hospital politics long enough to recognize subtext when he heard it. "You seem particularly confident tonight, Grant. Any special reason?" I handed him a small USB drive, palming it discreetly so nearby observers wouldn't notice the exchange. You might find this interesting reading material, particularly the sections dealing with surgical complication rates and documentation procedures. Schultz pocketed the drive without examining it, his expression carefully neutral. I appreciate your attention to detail, Grant. Quality control is so important in our field. Absolutely. Patient safety should always be our primary concern. He nodded and moved away, understanding that whatever information I'd provided would require private review. Schultz had been fighting Victor's influence for years. Now, he'd have the ammunition to finish the war. Across the room, Isla Corvin Dornell made her entrance in a stunning red gown that announced her presence like a declaration of war. She moved with predatory grace, acknowledging greetings while scanning the crowd for her target. When her eyes found Victor, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The evening's program began with the usual speeches about medical excellence and community service. Hospital Board Chairman Robert Hayes praised the staff's dedication, highlighting Victor's department for its innovative approaches to patient care. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a scalpel. During the dinner service, I watched Victor's table carefully. He seemed unusually animated, perhaps sensing that something was different, but unable to identify the threat. Tessa sat beside him, maintaining proper professional distance while occasionally exchanging meaningful glances. Their performance was flawless, except for the security cameras I'd positioned to capture every interaction. The real entertainment began during the awards presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, Chairman Hayes announced from the podium, before we continue with tonight's recognition ceremony, I'd like to ask our legal counsel, Isla Corvin Dornell, to address an important matter affecting our institution. Victor's face went pale as his wife approached the microphone. This wasn't part of the scheduled program, and everyone in the room knew it. Unscheduled announcements at formal events usually meant crisis management. Thank you, Robert, Isla began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system. I'm here tonight to announce that Northwest Medical Center will be implementing immediate reforms to our billing and documentation procedures following the discovery of serious irregularities in several departments. The murmur that rippled through the crowd was almost audible. Medical professionals understood that irregularities was code for fraud, and immediate reforms meant someone was about to face criminal charges. Effective Monday morning, we'll be conducting a comprehensive audit of all financial transactions, equipment purchases, and patient records from the past 24 months. Any staff members with knowledge of inappropriate activities are encouraged to contact our compliance hotline immediately. Victor's champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. Every eye in the room turned toward him, and I could see the exact moment when he realized his career was over. Furthermore, Isla continued, we'll be cooperating fully with federal investigators who will be reviewing our procedures and interviewing relevant personnel. Northwest Medical Center is committed to maintaining the highest standards of integrity and patient care. The ballroom erupted in whispered conversations as the implications sank in. Federal investigators meant FBI involvement, which suggested healthcare fraud or malpractice cover-ups. Board members huddled together, donors looked concerned, and staff members began calculating their own exposure. Victor stood abruptly, his chair toppling backward as he pushed away from the table. He looked like a man who'd just realized he was standing in quicksand, desperately searching for solid ground that no longer existed. If you'll excuse me, he mumbled to his table mates, then walked quickly toward the ballroom exit. I followed at a discreet distance, curious to witness his breakdown in private. The hotel's rooftop bar was nearly empty, offering Victor the illusion of privacy for his panic attack. He stood at the railing overlooking Elliott Bay, gripping the metal barrier like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Beautiful view, I said, approaching from behind. Shame you won't be able to enjoy it much longer. He spun around, his face a mask of rage and desperation. You did this. You destroyed everything. Actually, Victor, You destroyed everything. I just documented the process. I pulled out my phone and activated the recording app. Tell me, how does it feel to realize that your arrogance has cost you everything you've worked for? You don't understand the forces you're dealing with. I have connections, influence. This won't stick. Really? Because the FBI seems quite interested in your creative billing practices, and the state medical board is fascinated by your approach to malpractice documentation. Turns out, falsifying patient records is frowned upon in medical circles. His composure finally cracked completely. What do you want? Money? I can pay you. Whatever it takes to make this go away. It's too late for negotiations, Victor. You called me at midnight to gloat about sleeping with my wife. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences? That was a mistake. I was intoxicated, not thinking clearly. No, the mistake was thinking you could steal from the hospital, endanger patients, and seduce married women without anyone noticing. The mistake was underestimating the man whose wife you were using. I ended the recording and pocketed the phone. Victor's confession would make excellent evidence for the federal prosecutors. The authorities will want to interview you Monday morning, I continued. I'd recommend getting a good attorney. You're going to need one. Victor slumped against the railing, all the fight gone out of him. My career is over. Your career ended the moment you decided to put profits ahead of patients. Everything since then has just been cleaning up the mess. I left him there, staring out at the dark water, contemplating the ruins of his professional life. The gala continued below, but the real show was over. Victor Dornell had been exposed, and justice was finally coming for the patients and families he'd wronged. Back in the ballroom, I found Tessa standing near our table, looking lost and confused. The evening's revelations had shattered her world as completely as Victor's, though she probably didn't realize the full extent of her exposure yet. "Grant?" she said, grabbing my arm as I approached. "What's happening? Why is Isla talking about federal investigators?" "Apparently your boyfriend has been stealing from the hospital," I replied calmly, "along with falsifying patient records and covering up malpractice incidents. The FBI will be very interested in interviewing anyone who might have assisted with his schemes." The color drained from her face as she processed the implications. "I don't know anything about that." "Really? Because your signature appears on quite a few financial documents authorizing equipment purchases. The authorities will want to verify whether those signatures are authentic or forged." She stared at me with growing horror, finally understanding that her affair had led her into a criminal conspiracy. "Grant, you have to believe me. I never signed anything. I don't know how my name got on those documents." "That's between you and the FBI, Tessa. I'm sure they'll conduct a thorough investigation." The evening concluded with subdued farewells and nervous conversations about the hospital's future. Victor had disappeared entirely, probably consulting with attorneys or contemplating his limited options. Tessa rode home in silence, staring out the window at the city lights, perhaps wondering how her comfortable life had collapsed so completely in a single evening. As we pulled into our driveway, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Justice was coming for Victor Dornell, and the patients he'd wronged would finally receive the recognition they deserved. Sometimes the best revenge was simply ensuring that corrupt people faced the consequences of their actions. The gala had been Victor's final performance, his last moments in the spotlight before federal investigators dismantled his criminal enterprise piece by piece. Monday morning would bring arrests, indictments, and the beginning of a legal process that would destroy everything he'd built through fraud and deception. I'd kept my promise to make him pay for his arrogance. Now it was time to watch him face the consequences. Monday morning arrived with the kind of relentless drizzle that makes Seattle famous, gray clouds pressing down on the city like a heavy blanket. I sat in my office reviewing security protocols when Rico burst through the door, his usually calm demeanor replaced by barely contained excitement. "Grant, you need to see this. The FBI showed up at 6 a.m. with a search warrant for Victor's office. They've got forensic accountants, computer specialists, the whole team. Through my security monitors, I watched federal agents methodically dismantling Victor's professional life. They photographed everything, bagged computers, and interviewed staff members who looked increasingly nervous about their own involvement. The investigation was moving faster than I'd anticipated, suggesting they'd found evidence of crimes beyond what I'd documented. Any word on Victor himself? Arrested at his house around the same time. Isla wasn't there. Apparently she spent the weekend at her sister's place in Portland. Smart woman. Indeed she was. Isla had positioned herself perfectly, cooperating with authorities while maintaining plausible distance from her husband's criminal activities. She'd survived this scandal professionally intact, possibly even strengthened by her decisive response to the crisis. My phone buzzed with a text from Tessa. Need to talk, coming home early. The reckoning I'd been anticipating was finally at hand. Tessa had spent the weekend in a state of barely controlled panic, making hushed phone calls and frantically searching through our financial documents. She'd probably consulted with attorneys, trying to understand her legal exposure and options for damage control. I arrived home to find her pacing in our living room, still wearing scrubs from her abbreviated workday. Her face showed the strain of 3 sleepless nights, and her hands shook slightly as she turned to face me. The FBI wants to interview me tomorrow, she said without preamble. They think I was involved in Victor's fraud scheme. Were you? Of course not. I never signed any financial documents. I don't know how my name got on those papers. I settled into my favorite armchair, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served me so well throughout this entire situation. Tessa, we both know you've been having an affair with Victor for months. The question is whether that relationship extended to criminal activity. She stopped pacing and stared at me with a mixture of shock and fear. You know about Victor? I've known for weeks. The security footage was quite comprehensive. Security footage? I pulled out my tablet and showed her several still images from Victor's office, time-stamped and crystal clear. Her face went through a range of emotions: embarrassment, anger, resignation, and finally, desperation. Grant, I can explain everything. It wasn't supposed to happen. Victor was persistent, charming. He made me feel appreciated in ways that I didn't. We grew apart. You were always working, always focused on your security systems and protocols. Victor paid attention to me, made me feel desirable. So you decided to have an affair with a man who was stealing from the hospital and endangering patients. I didn't know about any of that. Victor told me he was working on special projects, innovative procedures that required discretion. I thought he was developing new surgical techniques. The explanation was pathetic, but probably honest. Tessa had always been susceptible to flattery and attention, willing to believe convenient lies rather than face uncomfortable truths. Victor had manipulated her expertly, using her emotional needs to gain access to her personal information. The forged signatures on the financial documents, I continued. How did Victor get samples of your handwriting? She sat down heavily on the couch, her composure finally cracking completely. He asked me to sign some birthday cards for staff members, said it would mean more coming from someone in administration rather than directly from him. I must have signed dozens of cards over the past few months, which gave him perfect samples to forge your signature on fraudulent documents. Oh my God! The full scope of Victor's manipulation was finally becoming clear to her. He used me. Everything was calculated, planned. Victor Dornell is a sociopath who saw you as a useful tool for his criminal enterprise. The affair was just a means to an end, a way to gain your trust and access to your identity. Tessa began crying, deep sobs that shook her entire body. I've ruined everything. My career, our marriage, possibly my freedom. How could I have been so stupid? You made choices, Tessa. Poor choices with devastating consequences. But stupidity wasn't the problem. Selfishness was. She looked up at me through her tears, perhaps hoping for forgiveness, or at least sympathy. Instead, she found the cold assessment of someone who'd already moved beyond emotional attachment. What happens now? Now you face the consequences of your decisions. The FBI will determine whether you were a willing participant in Victor's fraud or simply another victim of his manipulation. Either way, our marriage is over. Grant, please. We can work through this. I'll do anything to make it right. There is no making this right, Tessa. You betrayed our marriage, compromised your professional integrity, and potentially participated in criminal fraud. Some mistakes don't get fixed. I handed her a manila envelope containing divorce papers I'd filed that morning. You have 30 days to respond. I'd recommend getting a good attorney. You're going to need legal representation for both the criminal investigation and the divorce proceedings. She stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. You're really going to abandon me when I need you most? I'm not abandoning you, Tessa. I'm simply refusing to enable your self-destructive behavior any longer. You made your choices. Now you get to live with them. The next few hours passed in tense silence as Tessa processed the complete collapse of her comfortable life. Victor was in federal custody, facing charges that would likely result in decades in prison. Her own legal exposure remained unclear, but the FBI's interest suggested serious potential consequences. That evening, our daughter Allie called from her college dorm room. She'd seen news reports about the hospital scandal and wanted to understand what was happening. Dad, is it true that Mom was involved with Dr. Dornell? Your mother made some poor decisions that are now having serious consequences. The important thing is that you focus on your studies and don't let this distract you from your goals. Are you and Mom getting divorced? Yes, Allie. I filed papers today. There was a long pause before she responded. I'm sorry, Dad. I know this must be incredibly difficult for you. I appreciate your concern, sweetheart, but sometimes difficult decisions are also necessary ones. Your mother chose to prioritize her relationship with Victor over our family. Actions have consequences. After ending the call, I reflected on how completely the situation had transformed. A week ago, Victor had called to gloat about his conquest. Now he was in federal custody, his career destroyed, facing criminal charges that would define the rest of his life. Tessa was confronting her own legal exposure while watching her marriage, career, and reputation crumble. The best revenge had turned out to be simply documenting their crimes and letting justice take its course. Sometimes corrupt people destroyed themselves. They just needed someone with the skills and patience to properly document the process. Victor's midnight phone call had been intended as a moment of triumph, a final insult to the husband he'd cuckolded. Instead, it had triggered a chain of events that exposed his criminal enterprise and brought federal investigators into his life. Now he had plenty of time to contemplate the wisdom of that decision, probably from a federal detention facility where midnight phone calls were strictly monitored and recorded. The irony was perfect, and justice was finally being served. 3 weeks after Victor's arrest, I received an unexpected call from his attorney, a high-powered defense lawyer named Patricia Vance, who specialized in white-collar criminal cases. Her reputation for aggressive tactics and creative legal strategies had earned her a client list of wealthy executives and corrupt politicians. Mr. Solen, I represent Dr. Victor Dornell. I'd like to discuss a possible resolution to this unfortunate situation. I'm not sure what there is to discuss, Ms. Vance. Your client committed fraud, endangered patients, and attempted to involve my wife in his criminal activities. The evidence speaks for itself. Evidence can be interpreted many different ways, Mr. Solen. Dr. Dornell maintains his innocence and believes he's been the victim of a vindictive campaign orchestrated by someone with access to hospital security systems. The accusation was predictable, but futile. Every piece of evidence I'd gathered was legitimate, properly documented, and legally obtained through my authorized access to hospital systems. Victor's defense strategy apparently involved attacking the messenger rather than addressing the message. "Your client called me at midnight to brag about sleeping with my wife," I replied calmly. "I have the recorded conversation. Everything that followed was simply proper documentation of criminal activity that was already occurring. Recorded without his consent, which may not be admissible in court. Washington is a one-party consent state, Ms. Vance. I'm sure someone with your experience knows that recordings are perfectly legal when one participant consents to the documentation." There was a pause while she processed that information. "Dr. Dornell is prepared to make financial restitution to the hospital and accept responsibility for any administrative oversights. Surely that's preferable to a lengthy criminal trial that would be expensive and disruptive for everyone involved." "Administrative oversights? Your client falsified patient records to cover up malpractice incidents. People suffered because of his negligence, and families were denied justice because he altered documentation. This isn't about money, it's about accountability. Mr. Solen, I think you're allowing personal animosity to cloud your judgment. Dr. Dornell made mistakes, but destroying his life won't undo any harm that may have occurred. You're right about one thing, Ms. Vance. I am allowing personal feelings to influence my actions, specifically my personal commitment to ensuring that corrupt medical professionals face appropriate consequences for their crimes." I ended the call, amused by the desperation underlying Victor's plea bargain attempt. He was finally beginning to understand that his connections and influence couldn't protect him from federal prosecutors armed with comprehensive evidence of his criminal activities. The hospital had moved quickly to distance itself from the scandal. Victor was terminated immediately, his medical privileges revoked, and his name removed from all departmental materials. The board established a victim compensation fund for patients who'd been harmed by his negligence, and new oversight procedures were implemented to prevent similar fraud in the future. Tessa's FBI interview had gone poorly, according to her attorney. While prosecutors couldn't prove she'd knowingly participated in Victor's fraud scheme, her forged signatures on financial documents created significant legal exposure. She'd been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's outcome, effectively ending her career at Northwest Medical Center. Our divorce proceedings moved forward with mechanical efficiency. Tessa had few assets to claim and even fewer arguments to make, given her role in destroying our marriage. The house would be sold, proceeds divided, and custody of our adult daughter was obviously irrelevant. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she said during one of our final conversations. "Victor convinced me that he cared about me, that we had a future together." "Victor convinced you of what you wanted to believe, Tessa. He offered excitement, attention, and validation that you felt was missing from our marriage. The fraud was just collateral damage. Do you think I'll go to prison? That depends on whether prosecutors believe you were a victim or a co-conspirator. Either way, your career in healthcare administration is over." She nodded, finally accepting the full scope of her situation. "I suppose I deserve this." "You deserve the consequences of your choices. Whether you call that justice or punishment is up to you." The trial began 6 months later, generating significant media attention due to Victor's prominent position and the scope of his criminal activities. Federal prosecutors painted a picture of systematic fraud, patient endangerment, and institutional corruption that had persisted for years. I testified about the security footage, financial records, and documented evidence of Victor's crimes. His defense team tried to portray me as a vengeful husband orchestrating a frame-up, but the evidence was too comprehensive and well-documented to dismiss. Victor took the stand in his own defense, a decision that proved catastrophic. Under cross-examination, he revealed the arrogance and sense of entitlement that had driven his criminal behavior. He showed no remorse for the patients he'd harmed, no acknowledgement of the families he'd deceived, and no acceptance of responsibility for his actions. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: healthcare fraud, falsifying medical records, money laundering, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison, noting that his position of trust made his crimes particularly egregious. Tessa received a suspended sentence and community service after cooperating fully with prosecutors and demonstrating that she'd been manipulated rather than complicit. Her nursing license was permanently revoked, but she avoided prison time. As I watched Victor being led away in handcuffs, I felt a profound sense of closure. The man who'd called to gloat about his conquest was now facing the reality of federal incarceration, his career destroyed, his reputation in ruins, his freedom forfeit. The patients and families he'd wronged finally had justice. The hospital had reformed its procedures to prevent similar fraud. The criminal who'd thought himself untouchable was learning about accountability in the most direct way possible. I'd kept my promise to make Victor pay for his arrogance, but the real victory belonged to everyone he'd victimized through his greed and negligence. Sometimes the best revenge was simply ensuring that justice prevailed over corruption. Victor's midnight phone call had been intended as a moment of triumph. Instead, it had triggered the investigation that exposed his crimes and brought his criminal enterprise crashing down. He'd have plenty of time to contemplate that irony during his 15-year sentence, probably wondering how a simple security manager had orchestrated his complete destruction. The answer was simple. I hadn't destroyed Victor Dornell. He'd destroyed himself through his own criminal choices and arrogant assumptions. I'd simply documented the process and ensured that justice was properly served. Sometimes that's all revenge requires: patience, documentation, and faith that corrupt people will eventually face the consequences of their actions. Victor had learned that lesson the hard way, and justice had finally been served.